Top of the morning to you. My name is Josh. Thank you guys so much for watching. You have seen plenty of videos on how to tell whether or not your Levi's are vintage, what to look for, how to get a more specific date. In fact, we have a lot of those videos ourselves. But today we're going to focus on something a little bit different. With all the different minutia and markers and different things that you can do to find whether or not your Levi's are vintage, what can you do to find out if your Levi's are not vintage? Stick around and we're going to find out. Let's go. So when we talk about vintage clothing, we're talking about clothing that's 20 years or older. And this is a loose definition. Depending on the category of items that you're working with, vintage may not be 20 years, it may be more. With trading cards, it's like 40, 50 years. But with clothing, it's about 20 years. And this is a loose, generally accepted definition. Now, it's important to note that just because a pair of Levi's may be technically vintage, it may not necessarily be desirable like other vintage clothing is. Now, it's important to note that just because your Levi's technically are vintage, that doesn't necessarily mean they're desirable. And this is because many of the things that make Levi's desirable, like the manufacturing process, the quality, the stitching, the weight of the denim, stuff like that, that type of stuff may have been changed long before the 20-year marker. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the things that you can use to tell whether or not your jeans are not vintage. Now, one of the first ways you can determine whether or not your jeans are vintage is whether or not they were made in the USA. Levi's basically ended all USA manufacturing in 2001. After that, for a long time, there was no jeans by Levi's made in the United States. Now, Levi's did start manufacturing jeans internationally in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's really just a starting point for you to determine whether or not your jeans may or may not be vintage. Now, if jeans were made in the USA, oftentimes you'll see it on the back patch of the jean. You can see in this pair of jeans, it does not have made in USA on the back. So you can be pretty sure it's not made in the USA. Now, this isn't 100% true. There are some jeans that don't actually have made in the USA on the back that are still made in the USA. You would find that information on the care tags. Now, the next way is probably one of the most significant ways to determine whether your jeans are not vintage, and that's the care tag. The care tags were pretty significantly changed in the early 2000s. And here we'll have some examples. If your jeans have care tags like this, then your jeans are not vintage. This is a very common mistake that people make. People see these tags and think they're vintage. In fact, they are not. They are older. They are from the early 2000s, but they are not technically vintage. And at this point, Levi's had started making lots of manufacturing changes, and these are not generally high quality jeans. Now, another quick way you can tell is whether or not your jeans have a website on them. That's a quick sign that your jeans probably aren't vintage. Now, another tag marker to look for are jeans with lots of nylon tags, such as these. You can see this thing has like 1, 2, 3, 4 tags. And this jean is not vintage. In fact, this is probably a very modern jean within the last 10 years. This is the current tag system that Levi's uses on all of their modern jeans. Now, it does get a little bit murky with care tags in this regard. You've heard me talk about the black batwing logo tag in the past and how that is, generally speaking, a marker of vintage jeans. Well, there's a little bit of an exception because that tag bridged the gap between the 90s and the early 2000s. So there are some of those black batwing tags that aren't technically vintage. But you can figure that out very simply. These tags actually have date codes. So let's look at a date code right now. So what you would do is you would take a look at the tag right here, and you would flip it to the back side, and then real close up, you can see that right here it says 0201. That means this jean was produced in February of 2001. Not technically 20 years vintage. So there's a little bit of exception. Now, the thing is that these jeans may still share the same manufacturing quality as the ones from the 90s, so therefore may still have those desirable traits. but it is not technically vintage. Now, say you don't have any inside tags or external tags or anything like that, use the feel test. Once you've started to feel vintage jeans versus non-vintage jeans, you'll realize there's a fairly significant feel difference. A lot of times the jeans are like a thinner ounce denim, so they're not as thick or heavy duty, and if they have some stretch to them, that's probably a good sign they're not vintage. Levi's didn't put lots of stretch in their jeans, particularly in their workwear brands or 501, 505, stuff like that. So you can be pretty confident there's a lot of stretch. If it's got that thin feel to it, you're not holding a vintage denim. Now, of course, with all of these things, there are exceptions. And most of those exceptions come from the Levi's Vintage Collection, which is the Levi's reproduction of like some of their most well-known jeans. Levi's went back in time and basically did pound for pound perfect reproductions of these vintage jeans, obviously with a markup. And so sometimes it can be hard to determine whether or not you're holding an original or the reproduction. And the quickest way to determine whether or not you're holding a Levi's vintage reproduction versus a true vintage Levi's is the care tags, because they're going to have these care tags right here. You will not have all of the original tags like you did before. Now, if you have a pair of jeans that looks crazy vintage, that has selvage and all these different things, quickly double check that you don't have those like 4 tags that are inside the jean. If you do, you have an LVC reproduction. If you don't, you might have a true vintage jean. I know that I've been burned by that before, so just do your due diligence and make sure they're not reproductions. Well, I hope some of these tips were helpful for you in determining whether your jeans are not vintage. And if you have any other tips that you know of, leave them in the comments below. Subscribe if you're new and hit that notification bell if you want to stay connected with what we're doing. Hope you guys are having a good day. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.